9. She told me to behave, but something in her smile dared me to do the opposite. I wasn't expecting to see her that evening. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much of anything. It had been one of those long days where you drag yourself through routine, just looking for somewhere quiet to sit and let your mind breathe. That's what brought me into the little coffee shop on the corner, a place with mismatched chairs, the steady hum of an espresso machine, and sunlight spilling through wide glass windows like honey. I ordered my drink without thinking, more focused on finding a seat by the window than the taste itself. That's when I heard it. A voice. Calm, firm, yet softened with warmth. A voice that instantly pulled me backward in time. "Behave yourself," she said, almost laughing under her breath. I froze. My hand tightened around the cup. And when I turned, there she was, my teacher. Not in a classroom anymore, not framed by chalkboards and lesson plans, but sitting gracefully at a corner table, her presence still commanding in a way that stirred something deep inside me. She looked almost exactly the same, yet different. Her hair was swept back with a few loose strands brushing her cheeks. There was confidence in the way she sat, but also a quiet weariness around her eyes, like she carried more years of unspoken stories than I remembered. I don't know what got into me. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe the surprise of seeing her outside of all the rules and walls I used to know. But the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Only if you misbehave first." The second I said it, my heart jumped. It sounded bolder than I intended, a challenge wrapped in playfulness. For a beat, the air between us held still. Then she tilted her head, one eyebrow lifting in that familiar way that used to make me straighten in my seat years ago. But this time, there was no classroom. No audience. Just us. Her lips curved, the faintest smile tugging as though she was trying to decide whether to scold me or laugh with me. "Still cheeky," she said softly, shaking her head. I couldn't help but smile back. And suddenly, I wasn't just a former student standing awkwardly in a coffee shop. I was a man speaking to a woman, trying to find my footing in the strange balance between respect and curiosity. I asked if I could sit with her. She hesitated, just long enough for me to feel it, but then she nodded toward the empty chair across from her. As I pulled the chair out, the legs scraped gently against the wood floor, blending with the low hum of conversations around us. I sat down, the table between us suddenly feeling both like a barrier and a bridge. She wrapped her hands around her cup, steam curling upward. I noticed the way her bracelet shifted with the movement, catching the light. My own cup warmed my palms, but it wasn't enough to steady the quiet racing in my chest. For a moment, we didn't speak. Just silence stretching out, filled with the smell of roasted beans and the faint sound of jazz playing through hidden speakers. And then she glanced at me again, her eyes soft but unreadable, and I realized something. This wasn't just an old connection by chance. This felt like the beginning of something neither of us had words for yet. The first few minutes felt like walking on thin ice, every word carefully chosen, every glance testing how far the surface would hold. She was still my teacher in memory, but here, across a small café table, she was something more complicated, a woman, elegant, poised, carrying herself with that same authority that used to fill a classroom, yet softened by the casual setting. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, letting the heat settle into my palms, trying to steady myself. "It's been a long time," I said, my voice lower than I expected. She nodded, stirring her drink slowly. The tiny clink of the spoon against porcelain seemed louder than it should have been. "Years," she agreed. Her eyes flickered toward me and then back to her cup, as though she was measuring how much to reveal. "You've changed." I laughed under my breath. "I hope for the better." That earned me the smallest smile, barely there, but enough to loosen the knot in my chest. She looked at me then, really looked, the way she used to when I was fumbling over an answer in class. But this time, her gaze lingered differently, longer, softer, with a curiosity that mirrored my own. I leaned slightly forward, resting my elbow on the table. "And you haven't changed at all." The words slipped out honestly, without rehearsal. "At least, not in the ways that matter." Her spoon stilled, hovering over her drink. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she didn't correct me. Instead, she tilted her head, eyes narrowing just enough to suggest she was deciding whether to take the comment as a compliment or a bold overstep. "You always had a way with words," she said finally, her tone a mixture of caution and amusement. Before I could answer, our hands brushed. It happened so casually, both of us reaching for the sugar packets at the same time, that for a moment I thought she would pull away instantly. But she didn't. Our fingers touched briefly, just a whisper of contact, but it sent a ripple through me, as if the room had tilted on its axis. She drew her hand back slowly, her bracelet chiming softly against the table's edge. I tried to cover my reaction with a quiet laugh, but inside I felt the sting of electricity lingering where her skin had met mine. We drifted into conversation about ordinary things, where life had taken us, how quickly the years had passed. Yet every sentence seemed to carry something underneath, a subtext we both felt but didn't name. The café buzzed with voices and clinking cups, but around our little table, it felt quieter, as if the world was politely stepping back to give us space. Her perfume mixed with the earthy coffee aroma, subtle but distracting. I found myself leaning in unconsciously, pulled closer by the warmth of her presence. She noticed, I think, because her smile deepened, controlled, graceful, but unable to hide the flicker in her eyes. As the minutes stretched on, the awkwardness that had first hovered between us began to dissolve. What replaced it was something more dangerous: curiosity. The kind that made me wonder what she was thinking, what she was holding back, and whether I was imagining the same unspoken pull I felt tugging at me. For the first time that evening, I realized this wasn't just a reunion. It was a beginning. The longer we sat there, the more the air between us shifted. What started as polite conversation was becoming something else, something neither of us had planned. I could see it in the way her posture softened, how the lines of formality began to blur into something warmer, more familiar. I teased her gently about the way she used to raise an eyebrow in class when someone tested her patience. Without realizing it, I mimicked the gesture. She laughed, a sound that was lighter than I remembered, though it carried a hint of restraint, as if she wasn't used to letting herself laugh so freely anymore. That laugh did something to me. It cracked through years of distance, and made me bold again. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice, just enough for the words to feel meant only for her. "So, if I'm supposed to behave..." I let the pause hang, long enough for her to look up and meet my eyes. "What happens if you decide to misbehave first?" Her eyebrow arched in perfect, familiar rhythm, exactly the way I remembered, but this time it wasn't about discipline. It was about play. "You still enjoy testing limits, don't you?" she replied, her tone dry but softened by the curve of her lips. I grinned. "Only when someone makes it worth the risk." Her gaze lingered on me then, longer than it should have. And in that suspended second, I could swear the café faded around us. The clinking cups, the background chatter, the smell of roasted beans, it was all there, but distant. The only thing sharp and undeniable was the look in her eyes. Under the table, my knee brushed against hers. Just lightly enough that I could have passed it off as an accident. But I didn't move it right away. Neither did she. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, though I noticed her hand wasn't as steady as before. The spoon traced lazy circles, her bracelet catching the light each time, but her focus was elsewhere, on me. "Careful," she murmured, setting the spoon down. "Some rules still apply, even outside the classroom." I tilted my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Then maybe I'm waiting for you to break them first." Her breath caught, not loud, not obvious, but just enough for me to notice the shift. She glanced away, as though retreating into the safety of the window view, but her hand stayed resting close to mine on the table, close enough that if either of us moved an inch, we'd touch. The café had grown busier, voices rising, chairs scraping, but somehow it felt like the noise created a cocoon around us, a shield that made this strange, delicate game feel private. She turned back to me, finally, with that same measured look teachers give when they already know the answer but want to see if you'll say it. Only this time, there was no lesson, no grading, just the faintest curve of her lips, betraying her amusement, her hesitation, and maybe even her temptation. And in that moment I understood, this wasn't just conversation anymore. This was an invitation. Subtle, unspoken, but real. The playful banter lingered between us like smoke that refused to clear, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mood shifted. Her smile softened, her gaze lowered, and something in her posture told me the game was over, for now. She was still seated tall and composed, but the edges of her confidence seemed to loosen, as though she was letting me glimpse a part of her she usually kept hidden. She traced her finger along the rim of her coffee cup, her bracelet sliding quietly with each motion. "You ever think about how quickly time gets away from us?" she asked, her voice lower now, steadier but weighed down with something unspoken. The question caught me off guard. I leaned back slightly, watching her, sensing this wasn't rhetorical. "All the time," I admitted. "Sometimes it feels like you blink and suddenly years are gone." She nodded, almost absently, her eyes fixed on the swirl of steam rising from her drink. "It's strange. You spend so much of your life teaching, guiding others, and one day you realize." She paused, her hand tightening around the cup as though she needed the warmth. "You've been so focused on everyone else that you haven't noticed your own life passing by." Her words settled between us, heavier than the playful remarks from earlier. I could see the faint tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders rose just slightly as if she was bracing for me to judge or dismiss her honesty. But I didn't. I leaned in, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "That doesn't sound like wasted time. You've made a difference. That matters more than you know." Her eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time that evening, the authority I remembered from the classroom was gone. In its place was vulnerability, quiet, raw, and disarming. She blinked slowly, as though letting my words sink in. I wanted to reach across the table, to bridge the space between us, but I hesitated. Instead, I let my hand rest close to hers, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. She noticed. I could tell by the way her breath hitched slightly, though she didn't pull her hand away. "You always were kinder than you looked," she said softly, her lips curving in a smile that wasn't forced, wasn't guarded. I smiled back, but inside, I felt the weight of her words. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a confession of sorts, a glimpse of how she saw me now, not as a boy fumbling through adolescence but as someone who could sit across from her as an equal. The café's jazz track shifted, a low saxophone threading through the hum of conversations, and the atmosphere seemed to fold around us. The world outside the glass windows kept moving, but here, in this small, cluttered coffee shop, it felt like time had slowed for just the two of us. I let the silence stretch, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't want to break the fragile intimacy that had formed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but in her eyes I saw something that made my chest tighten: trust. And in that trust, I felt the first real crack in the wall between us. The air between us had shifted again. Her words still lingered in my chest, but now there was something else stirring, something heavier, more fragile, and undeniably alive. The small café table suddenly felt too narrow, as though the space wasn't built to hold the weight of what we weren't saying. She reached for her cup, but her hand faltered halfway. Instead of lifting it, she adjusted the sleeve of her sweater, fingers brushing against her wrist, the motion distracted. I caught myself watching those movements too closely, the delicate way she touched her own skin, as though steadying herself. And then, without thinking, I leaned forward. "You don't always have to hold everything together, you know," I murmured. Her eyes flicked up, startled, caught in mine. For a long, still second, either of us looked away. That gaze, it was the kind of silence that carried more than words ever could. I could feel it, a low hum in my chest, as if my heartbeat had adjusted to the rhythm of hers. When she finally did move, it wasn't away. Her hand lifted slightly, as though on instinct, and reached toward me. Just a small motion, fingers brushing against the edge of my collar. She smoothed it down gently, her touch light but lingering against the side of my neck. That was it. Just a simple adjustment. But the effect was anything but simple. My skin buzzed under her fingertips, every nerve awake, every thought dissolving into that single point of contact. Her breath caught softly, barely audible, but enough for me to notice. She seemed to realize how intimate the gesture had become, because her hand stilled, hovering against me for a moment too long before she withdrew. I wanted to stop her. I wanted to reach up, to take her hand and keep it there, pressed against me. But something held me back. Respect. Fear. The knowledge that one wrong move could shatter this delicate thing we were building. The cafe around us was loud enough now that no one else would have noticed, but for us, it felt like time had suspended itself. The sounds blurred, the lights softened, and all that remained was the closeness, the quiet pull that neither of us named but both of us felt. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but instead she exhaled, slow and shaky. "You make it very difficult to keep things simple," she whispered. My chest tightened. The honesty in her voice was a confession, even if the words themselves weren't. I leaned closer, close enough that my voice dropped to something almost private, almost daring. "Maybe simple isn't what we're supposed to be." For a moment, I thought she might answer. Her eyes searched mine, her expression caught somewhere between hesitation and surrender. The tension coiled so tightly that even the smallest movement, a glance, a breath, felt like it could tip us over the edge. But she didn't. Not yet. She sat back slowly, drawing in a deep breath, her composure returning like a shield sliding back into place. Still, the crack had been made. And in that fleeting touch, in that near confession, I knew we had crossed into something we couldn't take back. When the moment passed, I thought she might excuse herself, stand up, and retreat into the safety of polite distance. That would have been easier, tidier. But she didn't. Instead, she sat quietly, her hand resting against her cup, her gaze lowered as though weighing a choice only she could make. The cafe was growing louder, the evening crowd filtering in, filling the space with voices and movement. For the first time that night, the little cocoon we'd found ourselves in felt fragile, threatened by the noise. She glanced toward the door, then back to me. And that's when she asked, softly, almost reluctantly, "Do you have anywhere to be?" The question lingered casual on the surface, but I heard what she meant underneath. "Do you want to keep this going? Do you want to stay with me a little longer?" I shook my head. "Nowhere more important than here." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but something warmer. She let out a quiet breath, then gathered her things, her scarf draped loosely over her arm, her bag resting against her chair. I thought she was about to leave, but then she looked at me with that familiar raised eyebrow, softer this time, almost playful. "Walk with me." Those 3 words shifted everything. We stepped outside into the cool night air, the city humming softly around us. Street lamps cast golden pools of light on the pavement, and the air carried that faint, earthy scent that comes after a long day, mixed with the sweetness of nearby bakeries closing up. I slipped my jacket off without thinking and offered it to her. "You'll freeze," I said. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing my arm as she pulled it around her shoulders. The sleeves hung a little long on her, and something about the sight made my chest ache with tenderness. We walked slowly, our steps unhurried, shoulders brushing now and then as if by accident, but not really. Each touch felt deliberate in its own way, an unspoken permission neither of us voiced. At one point, our hands swung so close that the back of her hand grazed mine. She didn't move away. The streets were quieter here, tucked away from the main roads, and our voices carried more intimately. We talked about small things, books, places we'd always wanted to visit, the kinds of conversations that felt safe on the surface but hinted at deeper currents. Every now and then, she'd laugh softly, turning her head just enough that her hair brushed against her cheek in the lamplight. I watched her carefully, not just her words but the way she carried herself, the slight relaxation in her shoulders, the way her eyes softened when she glanced my way. She wasn't performing, wasn't holding herself in that rigid authority I once knew. She was simply present. And that, more than anything, felt like a gift. When we reached a quiet bench beneath a row of trees, she slowed, then sat down, adjusting my jacket closer around her. I joined her, the wooden seat creaking faintly under our weight. The night air wrapped around us, cool and steady, but the closeness between us radiated something warmer. She looked at me, really looked, her eyes reflecting the glow of the street lamp above. "You shouldn't make this feel so easy," she murmured, almost to herself. I smiled faintly, turning toward her, my voice low. "Maybe it's not supposed to be difficult." And in that stillness, on that quiet street, I realized, we weren't looking for excuses to part. We were both finding reasons to stay. The night was quiet around us, the hum of the city softened into the background. We sat together on the bench, a comfortable silence settling in, a silence that spoke louder than any small talk could. I could feel the warmth of her shoulder just inches from mine, the faint scent of her perfume carried on the cool air. For a while, neither of us said anything. She folded her hands in her lap, her fingers tightening lightly as though holding back words. I waited, letting her set the pace, not wanting to push what was already so fragile. Finally, she exhaled, a sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "I didn't plan for this," she admitted softly, her gaze fixed on the ground. I tilted my head, studying her. "Neither did I." She turned then, her eyes catching mine in the lamplight. There was vulnerability there, clear and unguarded, the kind of honesty people rarely allow themselves. "You're making me feel things I told myself I shouldn't." Her voice wavered, but only slightly. I leaned closer, just enough that my words reached her like a secret. "Maybe we're both breaking rules we didn't know how to follow." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, her hand slipped from her lap and brushed against mine. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just the softest graze of her fingers, a test. I turned my hand over, letting her fingertips rest against my palm, and when she didn't pull away, I closed my fingers around hers gently. The warmth of her hand settled into me, steadying something I hadn't realized was trembling inside. She gave the faintest squeeze, her thumb brushing once against my skin, and in that tiny motion, I felt the depth of everything she wasn't saying aloud. Her head tilted slightly, her hair falling across her cheek. I reached up, almost without thinking, and brushed it back for her. My fingers grazed the curve of her temple, and she let me, her eyes closing for just a moment as though savoring the touch. When she opened them again, her smile was small but real. "You're too young to know what you're starting." I smiled back, shaking my head gently. "And you're too wise not to know it matters." She laughed then, quiet and low, the sound muffled as she leaned her head against my shoulder. The weight of her there felt natural, grounding. I could feel her breath, steady and calm, and beneath it, the faint rhythm of her heartbeat through the layers of fabric. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just let the moment wrap around us, simple and unforced. When it came time to part, she stood slowly, drawing my jacket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at me, lingering, her eyes searching as though committing this moment to memory. "Thank you," she said softly, "not for the coffee, not for the walk, but for something deeper." I stepped closer, my hand brushing her wrist as I took the jacket back. "For what?" "For reminding me," she whispered, her voice almost trembling, "that I'm still allowed to feel." Before I could answer, she leaned in and pressed the faintest kiss against my cheek, soft, fleeting, yet powerful enough to set my chest burning. When she pulled back, her smile was gentle, but her eyes carried something stronger, promise. We said goodnight there under the street lamp, the distance between us closing not with words, but with everything unspoken. And as I watched her walk away, her figure fading into the golden light, I knew this wasn't an ending. It was the quiet beginning of something neither of us had dared to imagine before tonight.